I started writing what would become 7 Spells of Destruction when I was 13 years old. I didn't know it at the time, of course. I wasn't setting out to make an open world RPG, let alone one that would one day live inside Discord. I was just building a world because it felt like the only natural thing to do, having been fed on a steady diet of fighting fantasy books and being inspired by them. The earliest maps were pencil and paper, just ordinary lined notepads from a local school supply shop. I didn't even own a computer until a bit later, but I had places in my head, a town called Minetown, a place called Larton that lived in a swamp, something about ancient scrolls and people who had long since stopped trusting wizards. There was no Unity, no Unreal, no Game Maker, not even Flash. If you wanted to make a game in the early 90s, especially as a teenager in the UK, you either coded it in something like Amos Basic or Turbo Pascal, or you just designed it endlessly, waiting for the day you'd be good enough to bring it to life. So I kept designing. I drew maps, I wrote out stat blocks for enemies and encounters on refill paper. I invented towns, cursed temples, and races with cultural quirks. It was all a bit of a mess, but it wasn't wasted. Everything I made in those early years ended up feeding into what 7 Spells would eventually become. There's a common belief in game dev, especially in indie circles, that trying to create something too big, like an open world RPG, means you are doomed to fail. The scope is too vast and it needs an astronomical budget and more time than the average human has. This is only partially true, as you'll find out later in this video. The original races were already there, in early form: humans, elves, orcs. The idea that orcs might be split into 2 kinds, a brutal ruling caste and a smaller, subjugated, lesser group, came a bit later when I began thinking more about exploitation and class systems. That happened in my late teens, around the same time I learned what a strike was. Minetown's inner conflict started writing itself after that. At this stage there was no game, just lore. I hadn't coded anything, I wasn't ready, but I was laying bricks, slowly, for something I didn't even know I'd one day build. Some people prototype fast, that's valid, but I built the foundations before I ever touched the house. I wasn't sprinting toward a goal, I was wandering in a world that kept growing underfoot. And that's the lesson of chapter 1. If there is one, you can start building your open world without code, without a plan, and without permission. Just start writing. Because the part people always forget is you don't have to know what it is yet, you just have to keep going. Between 1992 and 1993, 7 Spells of Destruction became a real, playable game, just not in the form most people would recognize today. It wasn't digital. I didn't even own a computer yet, but I had paper, pens, and a battered collection of fighting fantasy books that taught me a powerful truth. A game didn't need a screen to exist, it just needed structure. So I wrote one. The first version of 7 Spells was a game book. A handwritten, fully playable choose-your-own-adventure RPG with rules for combat, skill tests, branching choices, and hidden consequences. It had dice, it had character sheets, it had stat tracking, magic, inventory management, and the ever-present risk of death. And it had real structure drawn from the world I'd already spent a year sketching. All the messy diagrams, maps, and background material began to fall into place. Lore became location. Ideas became encounters. Every page was numbered, every path was tested with a pencil and a D6. The tone, even then, was unforgiving. You could die early. You could make the wrong choice and never recover. There were no save points. If you cheated, you were only lying to yourself. It had 1,480 paragraphs. That number has stuck with me ever since. That's not a dabble. That's a full-length RPG campaign written by hand in a school notebook before I knew what scripting was. It was far too much for a kid to realistically finish, but I did. And that became the moment I realized something. This world could carry a system. It didn't just have depth, it had weight. At the time, I believed this was the final form the game would ever take. I couldn't imagine a future where I'd be able to bring it to life on a computer. I hadn't learned to code. There was no way to build a digital RPG. So I wrote the game in the only way I believed it could exist, on paper. That first version still influences the structure of the game today. You can trace the roots of scroll quests, death mechanics, stamina and skill tests, and branching towns all the way back to that notebook. Even the tone, harsh but fair, has remained unchanged. People often think a game begins when you open your first IDE, but for me, 7 spells began when I wrote paragraph 1, then followed the branch to paragraph 17, then rolled a 4 and died on paragraph 66. That was the moment the game existed. The second version, the digital one, would come much later, but the feeling of 7 spells, it was already there, and it hasn't changed. After finishing the handwritten gamebook in 1993, 7 spells sat idle for a while. I had built it in the only way I knew how, by hand on paper with dice. But I wanted to do more with it. I wanted it to be a computer game. I just didn't know how. Eventually I got a BBC Master 128K. I started learning BBC Basic, one of the few options available to me at the time. It felt like the first step toward building something real, but it quickly became a wall I kept crashing into. I tried to turn 7 spells into a text mode game like Zork, except without a parser. I wanted it to be choice-based, just like the original book, only navigated with inputs instead of flipping pages. But the problem wasn't the idea, it was the machine. The RAM was tiny. There wasn't enough memory to hold more than a small handful of paragraphs in memory at once. I couldn't fit the game, not even a fraction of it, into one program. Worse, BBC Basic required that I manually retype and convert every paragraph, every branch, every dice roll by hand, and that meant testing every one of them too. I failed over and over again. The world I had written was just too big for the tools I had access to. I still believed it was worth turning into a game, but I knew I had to change my approach. So I stopped trying to code it and went back to writing. This time I typed the whole thing into Interword on the BBC. It wasn't executable, but it was digital. That was enough. I printed the entire gamebook out on an old dot matrix printer. This became the second form of the game, a clean typed printed manuscript version of the original. That version sat on a shelf for years. Occasionally I would look through it, think about how to improve it, maybe make notes, but I couldn't do anything else with it. There was no practical way to convert it into a format I could use on a PC. The file format was obscure, the medium awkward, and I had no disk interface that could bridge the gap. Years later, while at university, I decided to retype it from scratch again. There was no clever automation, no scanner, no OCR. I opened Microsoft Word 6 and started from the beginning. Page by page, line by line, I began re-entering the entire game into a modern document format by hand. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't creative, it was brute force recovery, but it worked. That Microsoft Word version became the starting point for everything that followed. It was no longer locked in paper or trapped on an obsolete machine. The game was digital again, and this time it could evolve. It hadn't been rewritten yet. It hadn't become what it is now, but it had finally crossed the threshold from something I remembered making to something I could once again work on. After retyping the game into Word 6 during university, I finally had a complete digital version of 7 spells that I could do something with. It was no longer stuck on paper, and for the first time I had the technical knowledge to start treating it like code. Around this time, I started experimenting with CGI scripting. I had dabbled in Perl, learned the basics of the HTTP protocol, and started getting comfortable with how websites actually worked behind the scenes. That opened a door. Suddenly, I wasn't just imagining a game that could run on paper or in BASIC. I could now build something that people could play on the web. The first step was to get the game text out of Word. I exported the entire gamebook to plain text and began building tools to process it. Using regular expressions, I split the content into one file per location. These were stored as flat text files. No database yet, just simple named files on disk with paragraphs and labels. Then I wrote a second set of scripts to scan each location file and identify key structures, phrases like turn to 81, combat encounters, shops, traders, and so on. I converted those into a tag format, primitive markup that could be parsed by the game engine. This made it possible to turn raw gamebook prose into structured logic. It worked, horribly, but it worked. Version 3 of 7 Spells was a web-based game running as C++ CGI scripts. There was no database. Player data was stored in flat files, each one a text record read and written using Fstream. Every location was a file. Every user had their own file. It was fragile and prone to weird bugs if 2 users hit the same page at once, but it was playable. The user interface was awful. red text on a black background framed by boxy HTML tables and old-school fonts. It looked like something from 1996, but it ran, and you could explore it. And for the first time, other people could play it too. I shared the link with friends from my IRC network, and to my surprise, they started actually playing it. They gave feedback. They found broken links, loops that didn't resolve, fights that were wildly unbalanced. I started writing bug fixes for content I had written a decade earlier. I wrote balance patches for my teenage self's encounter design. As more people played, I realized I needed tooling, so I built an admin backend, a web interface that let me edit location files directly, tweak player stats, inspect inventories, and fix broken logic without editing files manually on the server. This was the first time the game truly evolved in response to its players. It wasn't just lore anymore, it was a system, a slow, clunky, barely held together system, but a real one. 7 Spells had become an online game. Primitive, yes, but no longer hypothetical. The world was alive, and now it had visitors. Once the flat file CGI version of 7 Spells had proven itself playable, the next step was inevitable. I converted the entire system to use my SQL. Every location, player record, item and encounter became structured data. This opened the door to something much bigger, multiplayer features. I added player chat, then player versus player combat, then item trading. Slowly, the game began to take on the shape of a true online RPG, albeit still wrapped in a primitive web interface. The locations were still built from text, but the game had structure, persistence, and a small but growing community. At its peak, the web version of 7 Spells had around 1,000 active players. Most of them came from my IRC network. Back then, that was where I lived, in channels full of other developers, sysadmins, and hobbyists. It was a word-of-mouth game, shared via /message, played in quiet tabs between shell sessions. A few people offered to help with the game content. They fixed typos, cleaned up combat balance, and helped convert old sections to the new database format. But time moved on. People left IRC, projects faded, the early collaborators disappeared one by one until the world felt empty again. Eventually, I let the project idle. It sat running on my server unattended, gradually slipping into silence. By the late 2000s, 7 Spells had no active users at all, and the IRC network that once carried it had mostly died out. So I shut it down, not out of anger, not from burnout, just recognition. The web-based experiment had run its course. It had taught me everything it was going to teach me. It had flaws, deep ones, in its design, layout, architecture, and world structure. Some of them I'd known about for years, others only became obvious when I stepped away. I archived the source code and left it alone. Years passed. I worked on other projects. The game never left my head, but it no longer ran. It was dormant again, like it had been after the notebook version and after the BBC version. Another era ended. Then in 2016, 5 years after I'd shut the game down, I learned Unreal Engine. Suddenly, the temptation came roaring back. The dream to finally turn 7 Spells into a real game, a 3D RPG with models, maps, sound design, all of it. It didn't go how I imagined, but that is a story for the next chapter. In 2016, I decided to try again. After years away from the project and having spent time learning Unreal Engine, I thought I might finally be able to bring 7 Spells into the modern age. Not as a web game, not as a game book, but as a full 3D RPG. I imagined a first-person experience, something halfway between Skyrim and Diablo, just on a much smaller scale. A single-player story-driven game stripped back from the old multiplayer ambition. I began work, I built terrain, I placed markers, I recreated regions from the lore, Larton Swamp, the ruins that would become Castle Scythe, the Wizard's Keep. To me, they were instantly recognizable. To everyone else, they were empty zones with nothing to do. I added a few test encounters, a handful of enemy behaviors, some visual effects, a basic UI. You could walk around, fight a few things, maybe stumble into a vague sense of atmosphere. I released some early alpha builds. It looked like a game if you didn't touch anything. But it was hollow. The problem wasn't the engine, it was time. The years I'd spent building the world in prose simply didn't transfer. The amount of work that had gone into making the text version feel alive, All the consequences, the flags, the reactivity, the lore would need to be done again, maybe 3 times over, to make the same world function in 3D. And that was even with the help of off-the-shelf assets and sound packs. Every interactive object had to be placed. Every NPC needed logic, models, animations. Every quest line needed triggers, dialogue trees, scene scripting. There were no shortcuts. I couldn't translate what I had. I had to rebuild it, and I didn't have the time. Then the reviews started. People on key distribution sites thought the game was finished. Some streamers downloaded it and assumed it was a complete product. They recorded videos, played through 5 minutes of empty terrain, and posted thumbnails like "How Games Die." One of those thumbnails still sticks in my head. There wasn't any real anger on my part, just a cold clarity. This was not going to work. The project was an experiment and it had failed. I archived the build, backed up the repo, moved on. I don't plan to revisit it. That version of 7 Spells is over. The world didn't survive the transition, but some ideas did. They waited quietly for a format that could carry them again. One that didn't need 3D models, terrain meshes, or 50-hour pipelines just to bring a single town to life. That format, as it turned out, was closer to the original than I expected. And it would come not through Unreal or Unity, but through text once again, this time running inside a chat client. After the Unreal version failed, I stepped away again. There was no drama, no grand shutdown, just another quiet pause. I had tried every form I knew how, and none of them had stuck, but the pause wasn't wasted. In the years that followed, everything else moved forward. I'd been working full-time as a web developer for about a decade at that point. I built real systems, e-commerce platforms, admin backends, client tools. I learned Laravel. I got better at PHP. I sharpened my C++. I stopped writing fragile prototypes and started building durable infrastructure. Then I discovered Discord. It was early, but the potential was clear. I began building TriviaBot, a casual, fast-paced bot for playing trivia games inside Discord servers. During the COVID lockdowns, it exploded in popularity. Tens of thousands of players, thousands of servers. For the first time, one of my side projects became something sustainable, financially and technically. With TriviaBot came income, reach, and infrastructure. I learned how to run subscription services. I built out dashboards, account systems, user management, scalable deployment, and full admin tools. I was no longer the teenager scribbling in a notebook. This was the adult version of me, someone who had now learned how to run a live service, write secure backend code, and support actual users. Alongside this, I built D++, a C++ library for Discord bots. It became one of the most popular in its space. It let me write fast, efficient, natively compiled bots with modern features and full access to the Discord API. And then it clicked. This wasn't just a new toy, this was my chance. Discord had become the modern equivalent of the IRC network I once built 7 Spells around. But now it was visual, accessible, and persistent. Embeds gave me layout, buttons gave me interaction, Markdown gave me structure. Even artwork, once impossible without an art team, was now within reach through generative models that would have been considered science fiction when I first started. With all this, I could bring 7 Spells back, not as a remake, but as a reformation. A Discord bot could deliver the story one location at a time. Each embed would represent a scene, a decision, a moment. Players would explore the world as a thread of linked messages, structured, legible, and reactive. They wouldn't need to install anything. They wouldn't even need to realize they were playing an RPG at first. It would simply begin. For the first time in decades, I wasn't struggling to make a version of 7 Spells. I was choosing how to make it right. All the failed versions before, the game book, the CGI files, the Unreal build, weren't wasted. They were the scaffolding that led to this moment. And now, finally, the tools, the experience, and the medium had aligned. 7 Spells could live again, and this time it would survive. I started by throwing out all the old C++ CGI code. It had been written for a much earlier time, built against the C++ 98 standard, riddled with awkward legacy patterns and full of bugs. Some were trivial, some were security vulnerabilities. It had done its job back then, but I knew there was no saving it now. What I kept was the database. All the content, the locations, the descriptions, the structure, had lived in my SQL since the web version. That part was still sound. I wrote Laravel migrations to modernize the schema, mostly to support Discord's Snowflake IDs in place of the custom UUID system I had previously used. That way, every player could be uniquely identified directly by their Discord account without needing a separate login system. I kept the location scripting language, the paragraph format, almost entirely unchanged. That decision made things easier. I could drop in content from the old game nearly verbatim. The location files that had once powered CGI responses could now power Discord embeds. Then I rewrote everything in C++20 this time. The bot core was built using D++, my own Discord bot library. It gave me a clean modern framework to work within. I wrote new handlers, new logic, a new game loop. Everything from inventory systems to conditionals to combat resolution was done fresh. For visuals, I leaned on what was already available. I used public domain CCZO sprites and emoji assets from opengameart.org to add simple flair. I reused logo graphics from the Unreal version, art I had commissioned years earlier, for the bot's icon and header branding. The layout of each embed drew inspiration from the web version, simple, blocky, readable. Consistent with what players had seen before, but restructured for Discord's format. And when things didn't work, when a location crashed or a choice didn't resolve, I got out the original 1993 gamebook and checked the source by hand. The paper version was still the truth. Some of the bugs I fixed had been sitting there for 30 years. This was the first time everything felt aligned. Modern tooling, reliable logic, proven content, and a platform that could carry it all without compromise. It wasn't just a revival, it was the game finally built properly. The choice to use generative AI for images came later. I understood, and still understand, the distrust and dislike of AI in creative circles. But I've always viewed tools as tools. In the same way I once used Interword to move the game off paper, or Perl to carve structure from plain text, or C++ to rebuild a broken world, I saw AI image generation as another tool in the pipeline, not a shortcut, a medium. Using a subscription to an AI service funded entirely by TriviaBot's revenue, I began generating location art based on lore excerpts and environmental details. I was cautious at first, expecting pushback, but the reaction from the early player base surprised me. They loved the images, especially when they fit. When a flickering tavern fire matched a written description, or when the spires of the wizard's keep took visual form in a way that matched their imagination. It didn't replace the text, it amplified it. There are still some who dislike this approach, and that's fine. But in the end, a developer, an author, a creator must use the tools available to bring their vision to life in the way they feel is right. It is the art that drives the artist forward, not the preferences of the audience. Seven Spells has always evolved through medium shifts, from notebook to dot matrix printout, from CGI flat files to Discord embeds. Generative tools are just the latest in a long chain of format changes, helping the game grow without ever changing what it is. The soul remains the same. Only the hands have changed, grown older, wiser and steadier with 30 years of experience. With hindsight comes clarity. 30 years of shaping the world of Seven Spells has taught me more about design, development and myself than any formal education could have. Start small, but don't stay small. The game began as a single branching book written in school notebooks. It only grew into what it is because each version added just a little more than the one before it. But I never stopped dreaming big. A small start doesn't mean small ambition. Ignore the rulebook, but understand why it exists. When I started out, I didn't even know the rules. I didn't know what "you can't do that" meant because I hadn't heard it yet. I found game dev communities halfway through the Unreal version. By then, I'd already made most of the mistakes they warned about, but it also meant I wasn't paralyzed by advice. I learned by doing. Those mantras, don't make an MMO, don't build an open world RPG solo, don't overreach, they exist for good reasons, but they are not laws. If you're prepared to put in the time, to fail and try again, to adjust your vision to match your tools, you can still do it. Scope is the enemy of progress. The Unreal version failed because I forgot this. World building is not the same thing as content creation. I had lore but no gameplay, systems but no experience. That failure taught me the value of prototypes, testing loops, and focusing on interaction. Time is the enemy of us all. Projects like this still take time, decades sometimes. There are no quick wins, no shortcuts that replace years of slow layering. What looks like overnight success is usually anything but. Tools matter. I've used Interword, Perl, CGI, C++20, Laravel D++, and generative image models. The tech stack has changed, but the mission has stayed the same. If a tool helps you realize your vision, use it. Don't wait for permission. Perfectionism kills projects. The early book versions were buggy. The web version was ugly. The Discord version launched missing features, but players played. If I'd waited to polish every edge, I'd never have released anything. Ship, then iterate. Your audience is not you. The scroll quests I find most rewarding aren't always the most popular. Elf players outnumber lesser orc players 3 to 1. The hard path gets the least traffic. I've learned to provide multiple ways through, not just the one I like best. Reading is friction. Discord is a text medium, but not all users read. Some skim, some click wildly, some just want loot. You can't change them, but you can accommodate them with buttons, visual summaries, and clear navigation. Those who want deep lore will find it, others need breadcrumbs. Don't listen to everyone, listen to your logs. Feedback is vital, but so is vision. The loudest players are not always the wisest. Many who begged for features vanished days later. Some of the best ideas came from silent logs and player behavior, not public posts. Celebrate your past. That notebook from 1993 still guides bug fixes today. Every past failure is a future lesson. What you write now may one day be your best resource. If there's one truth I've learned above all else, it's this. You can make an open world RPG as a solo developer, but not overnight, not easily, and not without learning to let go. The game isn't done, and neither am I.